I said earlier that one of the defining characteristics, at least in my opinion, of the Cold War seems to be this consistent pattern within the arms race itself and the sort of broadening potential for destruction to be missed opportunities or misperceptions that lead to a continuation of the arms race, a continuation of the conflict. Certainly, missed opportunities were there in the 1950s to potentially reduce the tensions between the so-called superpowers at the heart of the Cold War in such a way that the level of fear and paranoia might have been reduced and the threat of destruction reduced. And in this segment, what I want to do is talk about how through the 1950s you have this back and forth, this sort of hopefulness for a cool down in the Cold War that ultimately fails to occur, fails to happen. In 1953, Joseph Stalin dies, and there are some expectations of a less hard-line response to the United States from the Soviet Union as a result. Over the next few years, U.S.-Soviet relations will thaw and freeze and thaw and freeze. But consistently, both nations are engaged in efforts to improve their military stockpiles. I want to give you some examples then of how this thawing and freezing sort of unfolds over the course of the 1950s. And I want to start really talking about Europe again, just briefly. In 1955, the United States and the Soviet Union agree to end their 10-year joint occupation of Austria, which by and large will remain neutral during much of the Cold War. And there was even in that year a meeting of Soviet Premier Buchanan with United States allies in Geneva, Switzerland. So, you have, upon Stalin's death, you have some positive signs beginning to emerge. In 1956, Nikita Khruschev becomes premier in the Soviet Union, and in doing so calls for a new policy of, quote, peaceful coexistence. It's reminiscent in some ways of what Stalin had suggested, which you could have communism in one nation, contradicting the notion that communism was inherently global, that it was class-oriented and therefore applied to all those of a class wherever they were in the globe, and it had to expand, it had to spread. Stalin had once suggested that it was perfectly acceptable, it was perfectly possible for communism to exist within a single nation. And here we have Nikita Khruschev calling for peaceful coexistence, the idea that the eternal conflict that we see in the Cold War isn't an inherent necessity when you have communism and capitalism, but it's possible to find a sort of stalemate where the two can agree to coexist peacefully. It's more or equally important, perhaps, that Khrushchev actually denounces Stalin and the Stalinist policies of repression that had been part of the Soviet Union's past really since the 1930s. The reaction among some of the Soviet satellite states for all the potential that Khrushchev sort of engenders in the West, thinking that maybe there's an opportunity for a thaw in relations here. In the Soviet satellite states, it's also perceived as a potential for a thaw. And people in Eastern Europe in particular took Khrushchev at his word when he suggested that there would be a new toleration for different types of communism, for different expressions of communist thinking. One good example actually is Hungary. In 1956, the Hungarian government announced that it would pull out of the Warsaw Pact and that it would seek to reform its communist government to create what you might call this different expression of communism. But in November of that year, 1956, Soviet soldiers and tanks were battling in Hungarian streets, the streets of Budapest. It's hard to know how much was rhetoric, how much Khruschev was being pushed by hardliners that he had to answer to in his own government. But what became quite clear was that for all the talk of peaceful coexistence and different forms of toleration of communist ideas, there was also going to be an element within the Soviet Union that would push the more hardline Soviet control over those buffering satellite states in Eastern Europe. They weren't going to let those go. You're not going to break away and become independent. It makes sense, of course, that Berlin, which had been this point of contention in 1948 and 49, would emerge once again as a point of contention. Beginning in 1954, West Germany had begun a process of rearmament under British, French, and U.S. guidelines. So now West Germany is beginning to rearm, something that would seem, I think, quite frightening to the Soviet Union, a nation that had just, a decade or so earlier experienced the destruction of a German invasion. Well, in 1957, the first German troops actually joined NATO, and West Germany joins, making it an ally, part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You also have seen economic integration continue, so that clearly Germany, which was so destroyed after World War II, is now becoming a really participating economy within the larger Western economic world. And that makes Berlin, which you'll remember is set within East Germany, it will make Berlin a kind of island of capitalism and really consumer choice within this Soviet satellite state of East Germany, which is still suffering under considerable poverty, frankly. It's also worth noting that U.S. bombers and those missiles that we talked about, the intermediate range missiles, are located in West Germany, but bombers in particular. It was not uncommon for East Germans to seek to access the economic success of the West. And in Berlin, you have this point where East Germans can pass across into the Western world and work and seek opportunity. What the Soviets have begun to realize is that Berlin is sort of this hole in the barrel. And the contents, oftentimes the most desirable contents of the barrel, can escape through that hole. So that your best and brightest, your smartest, your most educated, those who see for themselves opportunity in the West, are in a position through Berlin to access that opportunity and to leave the Eastern Bloc. Khruschev really begins to seek to take advantage of American fears over this missile gap, over the technology gap, to solve the problem of a divided Berlin once and for all. And as early as November of 1958, Khruschev will announce the first of several ultimatums. Ultimatum is just if you don't do X by a certain time, Y will follow. That's all an ultimatum is. Khruschev says that if the West has 6 months to remove its forces from West Berlin and begin talks about reunifying Germany and whether or not Germany should be rearmed at all. I mean, that's the Soviet fear, after all. It's both a fear of capitalist success and it's a fear of a rearmed German nation. Khruschev went on to say that if the Allies, if the West, the United States, etc., would not agree to his demands, then the Soviet Union would recognize East German control over all of Berlin, thus allowing the Soviets to avoid getting trapped in any obligations it may have to maintain that corridor connection to Berlin, and allowing the East Germans to effectively control all those routes to Berlin and shut them down so that we would have another blockade of Berlin. Eisenhower refuses. He refuses to budge. Khruschev, pretty smartly probably, refuses in the late 1950s to really press his advantage and push the issue of Berlin, but it's there, it's hanging around. Instead, he suggests that maybe what's needed is more opportunity for a back and forth relationship with the United States. It would be good if you had major figures visiting, so that you'll have Khruschev coming to the U.S., you'll have Richard Nixon visiting Moscow, and that there'll be possible options to discuss these issues on a personal basis so that the two competing enemies, opponents, can get to know one another. Part of this knowing one another would come at a summit meeting to be held in Paris, France, in May of 1960. And what you need to know as background to this Paris meeting is that the United States had been using its spy capabilities, particularly the CIA and a plane called the U-2, to fly over Soviet airspace and take reconnaissance photographs. Eisenhower was very concerned that these overflights would alienate the Soviet Union, would destroy the potential for peaceful coexistence, if you will, and Khrushchev's kind of good feeling. But he was assured by, among others, John Foster Dulles, that one more or just another couple of flights might be possible. And again, remember, the U.S. is really trying to figure out how many ICBMs the Soviets have. What is the real threat of the missile gap, if there is one? What no one in the Eisenhower administration knew in 1960 is that the Soviets had developed anti-aircraft missiles capable of reaching the tremendous altitudes where the U-2 spy plane flew. That was one of the advantages of the U-2. It flew at extreme altitudes. It had these massive wings, almost allowing it to coast at those high altitudes. It moved fast, and it moved so high it just couldn't be hit by the technology of the time when it was developed. But what happens surprises the U.S. The Soviets shoot down a U-2 spy plane flown by Francis Gary Powers. Now, Powers is a CIA Central Intelligence Agency operative. The idea was that if a pilot were to be shot down, the pilot of U-2 were to be shot down, they had an obligation to make sure they weren't captured. The expectation, even once it's realized that Francis Gary Powers' U-2 is lost, the expectation is, well, we're still okay. The Soviets still won't be able to prove exactly what's going on in terms of world opinion until the Soviets brought out not only photos of the wreckage of the U-2 plane, but they brought out a live Francis Gary Powers himself. The United States was caught with a red face because they denied the U-2 plane. They denied that it existed. They denied that it had overflown Soviet airspace so long as the photos were out there, but they could not deny Francis Gary Powers when he was brought out. So it was embarrassing for Eisenhower. Now the reality is Eisenhower had expected some flashback from Khruschev for a while, and Khruschev realized the U-2 flights were going on, but he'd kind of been quiet as the Soviet Union developed these missiles. And Eisenhower and his administration had assumed that it was okay, that if Khruschev had complaints to make, he would make it, or make them. Instead, it turns out that Khruschev and the Soviet Union had gotten tired of complaining. They thought it showed weakness, and they'd concentrated on developing arms to deal with the problem. Well, the whole purpose of telling you this is that Paris Peace Conference. Eisenhower shows up for the conference only to realize that Khruschev is displaying this huge public anger over the U-2 incident. The Soviets demand that Eisenhower publicly apologize at the summit before they will negotiate, and when Eisenhower refuses to apologize, Khruschev and the Soviet representatives walk out. Moreover, they withdraw an invitation for Eisenhower to visit the Soviet Union, an invitation that Eisenhower had planned to accept. We'll never know how different this Cold War may have been had it not been for incidents like these that seemed so promising of diffusing the tension of the Cold War, but ultimately, because of misperception, misunderstanding, and in some ways gamesmanship, led to nothing or very little. As a result, the Cold War would continue. And the longer it continued, the more danger there was that something would go wrong. We'll pick up there in the next segment or so.